The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs that morning, a typical scene at Franklin County Courthouse. Yet, something felt different. The air was thick with anticipation, as the usual proceedings were overshadowed by one key detail. Ethan Rowland was about to face the stern judgment of one of the county's most respected figures, Judge Henry Porter. Ethan Rowland, a 17-year-old with the world at his feet, was well known in the town, but not for reasons that would make anyone proud. A son of privilege, Ethan had built a reputation for reckless behavior, an overinflated sense of entitlement, and a complete disregard for the consequences of his actions. His name was often associated with trouble, but because of his wealth, he was used to getting away with it, until now. This time, his luck was about to run out. Judge Henry Porter, on the other hand, was a man whose reputation preceded him. Known for his sharp intellect and unwavering integrity, Judge Porter was a figure who struck fear into the hearts of those who appeared before him. He was a man who believed in justice, but also in fairness, a man who saw through arrogance and entitlement with a sharp eye. His courtroom was a place where the rules mattered, and where the consequences of one's actions were never negotiable. Ethan arrived at the courthouse with his typical arrogance. Dressed in expensive sneakers, designer jeans, and a hoodie worth more than most people's monthly rent, he strolled into the courtroom like it was a casual day at the mall. His lawyer, a nervous-looking man named Vance, quickly followed behind, trying his best to minimize the spectacle Ethan had created. As Ethan sauntered toward the defense table, the courtroom, usually a sea of hushed voices, fell into a stunned silence. Everyone's eyes turned to him. Some murmured. Others watched with a sense of disbelief. Ethan, however, seemed completely oblivious to the tension he had just created. With a dismissive wave, he motioned for his lawyer to move aside as he plopped down on the bench, his backpack hitting the seat with a thud. His demeanor oozed entitlement, his chewing gum snapping loudly as he surveyed the room with a bored expression, as if this were just another casual outing for him. The room held its breath as the judge entered, his presence commanding immediate respect. Judge Porter was in his mid-50s, tall, with a frame that exuded authority. The second he entered, the murmurs died down, and a respectful hush fell over the room. The energy shifted from casual chatter to something far more serious. Judge Porter didn't need to raise his voice to assert control. His mere presence was enough. All rise. The bailiff's voice rang through the courtroom, and the people in the gallery immediately stood. Ethan, clearly irritated, hesitated. His eyes rolled with annoyance as he let out a heavy sigh, but reluctantly, he stood. His posture, slouched and unimpressed, was the first indication of how he intended to approach the situation. Judge Porter adjusted his glasses, opened the case file, and began the proceedings. The case was straightforward, a series of traffic violations compounded by an incident of reckless driving. Ethan, in his usual defiant manner, had endangered a cyclist's life. What could have been a typical hearing was about to take a dramatic turn, however, thanks to Ethan's complete lack of respect. As Judge Porter read through the charges, Ethan's posture shifted dramatically. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, and his eyes narrowed, signaling his disdain for the proceedings. His body language screamed arrogance, an obvious attempt to display his lack of concern. The room could feel the tension rising. Even the most seasoned courtroom regulars could sense that something was brewing between the judge and this arrogant teenager. Ethan continued to tap his fingers loudly on the table, his eyes not once meeting the judge's. His lawyer, clearly embarrassed, leaned in and whispered something urgently, but Ethan waved him off without a second thought. He had no intention of taking this seriously. Judge Porter, unfazed by the teenager's blatant disrespect, continued with calm professionalism. His voice remained even and deliberate, carrying an underlying weight that made it clear to everyone in the room that this was not going to be an easy ride for Ethan. The judge asked Ethan to confirm his identity. Ethan barely looked up, muttering a half-hearted response. "Yeah, that's me," he said, his voice dripping with indifference. The room was silent for a moment, a collective gasp spreading across the gallery. How could someone this entitled show so little regard for the seriousness of the situation? The judge, however, didn't flinch. His sharp eyes lingered on Ethan, his gaze steady and unwavering. "Mr. Rowland," Judge Porter began, his tone unwavering, "in this courtroom, we adhere to a certain level of decorum. I suggest you adjust your tone accordingly." Ethan, still unbothered, smirked and leaned back further into his chair. "Sure thing, Your Honor," he replied sarcastically. The room gasped once more, this time in shock at Ethan's complete lack of respect. Even his lawyer's face turned crimson, burying his head in his hands. But Judge Porter remained unshaken. His calm, composed demeanor was exactly what was needed to keep Ethan's arrogance in check. With a firm but steady voice, he addressed Ethan once more. "Mr. Rowland, do you understand the charges brought against you today?" Ethan let out a loud sigh, rolling his eyes dramatically. "Honestly, no," he muttered. "It's just some dumb tickets and someone getting scared because I hit the gas too hard. This is a waste of time." The room fell into a deep silence. All eyes turned to Judge Porter, waiting for his response. Judge Porter carefully closed the file in front of him, removed his glasses, and placed them deliberately on the bench. The moment seemed to stretch on, the air thick with anticipation. When he spoke again, his voice was measured, deliberate, and unwavering. "Mr. Rowland," Judge Porter said, his tone as calm as ever, "I would advise you to choose your words carefully from this point forward." Ethan, still unfazed, shrugged, clearly uninterested in the gravity of the situation. "Whatever, it's not like I hurt anyone. This whole thing is ridiculous," he muttered, glancing around the room, hoping for some support, but receiving none. The atmosphere was thick with a tension that Ethan couldn't yet comprehend. He had no idea what he was about to face. Judge Porter, ever composed, did not allow Ethan's dismissive attitude to rattle him. Instead, he took a slow breath, closing the folder before him. The quiet that settled over the courtroom seemed to amplify the judge's every movement. Porter leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with Ethan. His calm demeanor had not wavered, but there was something in the way he stared that made Ethan's bravado begin to falter, though he refused to acknowledge it. "Mr. Rowland," Judge Porter began, his voice steady yet piercing, "do you recall the incident from 2 weeks ago that brought you here today?" Ethan shifted in his seat, clearly bored. "Some guy on a bike swerved. I honked, and he moved." "End of story," he replied, his voice lacking the seriousness the situation demanded. His posture remained relaxed, a far cry from the tension building in the room. The judge's eyes narrowed slightly, his gaze unwavering. "End of story?" he repeated, his tone deliberate. "Let me clarify something for you, Mr. Rowland. That guy on a bike was a 45-year-old father of 2. He was riding in a designated bike lane when you, in your reckless driving, accelerated toward him, forcing him to swerve and crash. Mr. Diego Alvarez sustained injuries to his shoulder, requiring medical attention. He has since been unable to work as a delivery driver, and his family has suffered because of your actions." Ethan's smirk faltered. The words hit him like a cold slap, and for the first time, the room could see the tiniest crack in his wall of arrogance. His eyes flicked briefly to his lawyer, who whispered something urgently under his breath. But Ethan, in his usual fashion, waved him off, uninterested in taking any advice. His defiance was still present, but now there was a hint of unease beneath it. "I didn't hit him," Ethan muttered under his breath, as though his words could erase the reality of the situation. "He's fine." Judge Porter's expression remained stoic, but his eyes burned with an intensity that made the teenager shrink under his gaze. "Does this sound like no harm, no foul to you, Mr. Rowland?" the judge asked, his voice firm, but calm. Before Ethan could respond, the judge gestured toward the gallery. "Mr. Alvarez is here today," Judge Porter said, his voice carrying through the room like a challenge. "Would you like to hear from him directly?" The room seemed to hold its breath, the tension rising in waves. Ethan's bravado, which had been so unshakable just moments ago, began to crack. His eyes darted nervously toward the second row, where a man sat, his arm in a sling, his face weathered with the kind of quiet suffering that spoke louder than any words. Mr. Alvarez, the man whose life Ethan had nearly shattered, sat in silence, his face free of anger, but full of quiet disappointment. The look in his eyes, so deeply hurt, pierced through Ethan like a blade. There was no screaming, no shouting, just a weight of disappointment that Ethan couldn't ignore. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, a slight flush creeping up his neck. For the first time in his life, his wealth and entitlement didn't shield him from the consequences of his actions. He squirmed under the gaze of the man he had hurt, his confidence now replaced with discomfort. "I'm sure he's fine," Ethan muttered, his earlier bravado gone. His voice, once full of cocky defiance, now seemed small, weak. Judge Porter leaned forward slightly, his gaze never leaving Ethan. "Mr. Rowland," he said, his voice soft, but the weight of his words carrying unmistakable power. "Your dismissal of this man's pain speaks volumes about your character. But this isn't just about him. It's about something much bigger. This is about the precedent we set when individuals of privilege believe they are above accountability." The courtroom was so silent that it felt as though time itself had frozen. The sound of the court reporter's pen scratching against the paper was almost deafening. Judge Porter tapped his pen lightly against the desk, as if gathering his thoughts before delivering the next line. The suspense in the air was palpable. "Since you seem unconcerned about the consequences of your actions, perhaps it's time you experience them firsthand," Judge Porter said slowly, his voice calm but heavy with significance. Ethan's defiant expression faltered entirely, the cocky smirk wiped from his face. "What's that supposed to mean?" he asked, his voice now tinged with genuine concern. For the first time, the arrogant teenager showed vulnerability, though he was still trying to mask it with a facade of bravado. Judge Porter gestured for the bailiff, who handed him a stack of papers. The judge glanced down at them, flipping through the documents with deliberate slowness, before turning his eyes back to Ethan. The moment was like a heavy weight pressing down on the young man, and he could feel it sinking in, slowly but surely. Judge Porter's voice broke the silence again, this time delivering Ethan's fate. "Your sentence will include significant fines, mandatory community service, and court-ordered empathy training," the judge began, his tone measured. "But it is not just these penalties that will affect you, Mr. Rowland. It is the message they carry. They are designed to remind you that no one, no matter how rich, no matter how privileged, is above the law." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The words hit harder than he could have ever imagined. There was no leniency here, no escape from the reality of what he had done. His sense of entitlement, which had protected him for so long, was no match for the cold, unrelenting weight of true justice. Judge Porter's final decision ensured that Ethan would face the consequences of his actions, forcing him to confront a reality he had long avoided. As the gavel came down, sealing Ethan's fate, the room was filled with an eerie silence, broken only by the sound of the judge's voice delivering his closing words. "This will be a lesson you will never forget."